You and I know true value hides. Mason Carter walked into that dealership just needing a cheap ride for his little girl. The dealer, Logan Pierce, saw only grease on Mason's hands. He saw a peasant, not a priority, refusing to help. He just wanted to humiliate him. Logan pushed a dead, dust-covered Aston Martin with mangled paperwork and deep, ugly scratches, thinking he was selling pure garbage. He chuckled as the struggling father left. The whole world thought Mason got scammed. But vision pays off. On night 14, Mason found a secret mark under the dash, changing everything. This wasn't scrap metal. It was a $10 million automotive legend. Stick with me here. We need to uncover the incredible secret buried deep inside that battered old Aston Martin. Because Logan Pierce was about to pay the ultimate price for his blindness. Mason Carter spent most of his adult life quietly anchored in Millbrook, Pennsylvania. He was a guy who measured success not by wealth but by the steady daily grind of raising his little girl alone. His wife Rebecca passed away 3 years earlier, a swift illness that left behind a massive crushing mountain of medical debt and an 8-year-old named Ella, who kept smiling anyway though she decided heavy grief was something she simply refused to carry. Mason fiercely respected her quiet strength. He honored that resilience daily by packing her lunches and braiding her hair, and driving her to school in a beat-up sedan that served for 3 years, as living proof that a guy with calloused hands and deep debts could keep his family's world perfectly intact. He used to be a master mechanic over at Dawson Brothers Repair, the rare talent who could diagnose a broken engine just by listening. He saw the harmony in metal and friction the way musicians hear perfect pitch. Then a brutal shop accident damaged his left hand, severely slowing his pace. It never stopped his drive, but the severe injury definitely changed his reality. Too slow for the main shop floor, he adapted, setting up his own workspace in a cheap rented Maple Street garage, hustling through whatever auto repairs the locals brought over, earning barely enough to survive. The day his life completely flipped hit without warning, just like destiny always does. Mason fired up the rusty sedan, pulling slowly out of their tight driveway, only to feel the tired old engine choke right at the corner of Millbrook Avenue and 4th Street, sitting directly outside the local elementary school, just 7 minutes before Ella's big spring performance was set to start. Sitting there in her bright yellow dress, holding a handmade paper sunflower for her big act, the brave little girl refused to shed a single tear. She just looked at her dad and calmly said it was okay. They could walk, so they hustled, and she arrived with 2 minutes to spare. Standing quietly in the back of that crowded auditorium, Mason watched his kid perform. In that moment he saw the harsh, undeniable truth with total clarity: that tired old sedan had officially driven its final mile. He urgently needed dependable wheels. He kept $4,200, stashed inside a simple kitchen drawer, scraped together over 6 grueling months of taking literally every dirty job available. Now he planned to drop every single penny on a vehicle that wouldn't let Ella down again. Logan Pierce's luxury dealership. Pierce Prestige Motors stood on Route 9, a flashy glass monument to the elite wealth that regular, hard-working Millbrook locals usually just drove past without ever stopping. Logan spent 10 long years building his shiny automotive empire, flipping high-end used luxury cars, exotic Bentleys, and Ferraris. You and I know places like this. They sell Rolls-Royces to guys in fancy coats, pushing rides worth more than most houses around here. Logan was 38, tanned and dressed to intimidate. A guy who treated anyone without deep pockets like they were nothing more than worthless scrap metal. So when Mason Carter stepped into that showroom wearing a faded canvas work jacket, bearing grease stains on his arms and carrying himself with quiet respect, Logan did not see a buyer. He just saw trash. His sales team knew that arrogant glare instantly, suddenly finding reasons to stare at the floor. Logan flashed Mason that fake hollow smile reserved for folks he plans to brush off fast. Mason was direct. He just needed a solid, reliable used car. Nothing flashy. Budget was $4,000. He mentioned his tools were right outside, ready to check the engine and parts himself. Logan kept a straight face, but a cruel spark ignited. A sick kind of amusement. The kind of joy shallow men get when they plan to humiliate someone who actually works. He flatly told Mason $4,000 would not buy a single car inside. Instead, He offered whatever rotting heaps happened to be decaying out in the back dirt lot. He marched Mason out a side exit, stepping onto the rough gravel behind the shiny dealership, out where forgotten machines were dumped like scrap iron, rusting away in jagged lines under the baking sun. Stick with me here. At the row's end, trapped under a canvas tarp caked in heavy grime, rested a sleek shape that clearly didn't belong with the worthless junk. Logan ripped the tarp away, showing nothing but pure theatrical disgust. And there she sat, a 1960s Grand Tourer, long, sharp, and shining silver beneath years of dust, sporting that legendary Aston Martin wing on the hood, standing like a champion that had just been forgotten. The front glass was shattered. Deep, ugly gashes scarred the metal down the length of both sides. A back panel was crushed from an ancient wreck, while the seats inside were ripped wide open and stained dark. Logan crossed his arms, mocking the machine as a rolling corpse. He offered to let Mason drag the scrap away for $3,800. He dropped that low price like it was a cruel joke. But Mason was not laughing. Hands pocketed, he studied that broken steel. He had 20 years of experience seeing life inside dead engines. The lines of this frame felt special. Those wheel curves looked custom-shaped by hand. He could have just walked. He was still thinking it over when little Ella left the main gate. She walked right up with pure wonder and pressed her tiny hand flat against that ruined Aston Martin hood. She beamed that bright, hopeful smile she gave everything. She looked at her dad, calling it the most beautiful car she had ever laid eyes on. Mason stared at his little girl's hand on that filthy silver metal. He reached into his jacket, grabbing the envelope. The drive back took 40 minutes. Mason towed that neglected masterpiece on a rented flatbed, Ella riding shotgun beside him. You and I know how neighbors talk. Turning onto Maple Street, folks were already judging the metal. Mrs. Kowalski just watched from her porch, coffee in hand, saying absolutely nothing at all. Which, if you knew her, spoke volumes about the junk. The two brothers renting the place across the street just watched. They traded a look I didn't even need to translate. The pitying stare you get when others think you just bought overpriced scrap metal. The garage door rolled shut behind the Aston Martin. I stood alone with it for a long minute. I rested my hand on the hood, right where the dealer had touched it. Then I grabbed my flashlight and got straight to work. I didn't sleep a single wink. I started at the grill and worked back. Every detail I found deepened the growing mystery. The straight-six engine had a displacement that totally defied every factory catalog I had ever memorized. It wouldn't crank over. A completely dead battery, bone-dry fuel lines, and an ignition system taken apart on purpose. This wasn't some random act of blind vandalism. It was precise. Someone purposefully made sure this classic machine would never start up. The wiring harness under the dash was surgically sliced open in a few specific spots. Highly methodical, I filed that clue away and kept moving. The brake lines were flawless. The frame hid zero structural damage beneath its dusty shell. Original suspension parts, all sitting there in incredibly pristine condition. It was as if someone had perfectly maintained its hidden life support systems, but intentionally crippled its ability to ever actually drive anywhere. That is a highly specific, brilliant type of deception. An hour before dawn, the underside of the hood finally stopped me cold. I was flat on a creeper holding up my work light. Come look at this with me. The beam caught a bizarre bolt pattern that wasn't factory standard. Next, a hand-welded bracket unlike anything I had ever seen on an assembly line. Finally, a chassis rail boasting a heavy reinforcement running down its entire length. Hand-fabricated too, forged from an alloy clearly distinct from the surrounding metal. I slid myself out. I sat on the freezing concrete floor, connecting the dots on what those three upgrades actually meant. Someone had clearly built these car parts by hand. This wasn't an aftermarket modification job. It was original factory construction. An engineer solving complex performance problems the mass production lines hadn't even figured out yet. At 9 the next morning, I called Logan's dealership demanding the vehicle's full paperwork. Title history, import logs, prior registrations. Logan picked up himself. His smug tone proved a good night's sleep hadn't cured his total lack of vision. He reminded me the classic car sale was completely final, sold as is. And I had taken on 100% responsibility for the scrap metal I bought. I pressed him for the records anyway, He told me to get lost and hung up the phone. I slammed the phone down on the workbench and stared directly at the B. Aston Martin. Right then I made a silent vow that I was never going to give up. That evening, my daughter finished her homework, sitting at the folding table by the garage door while I kept grinding away. She sketched the vehicle. The details were messy, but she perfectly captured its bold spirit, nailing that massive hood and the subtle, elegant sweep of those front fenders. At 9 o'clock she flagged me down. Not for help with a math problem, though. You see, she'd been exploring the cabin while I worked and discovered a hidden treasure inside the glove box. An old black and white photo stamped on the thick faded paper of a forgotten decade. The faded photo showed the Aston Martin. It was clearly the same classic car, parked boldly before a grand estate house with huge columns. One corner of the photograph was ripped away. Faded blue ink on the back held a message for those who looked deeper. 4 handwritten words: "Prototype never dies." Mason studied that picture for a long time. Ella peeked over her drawing. She asked her dad what a prototype actually meant. He explained it was the original, a total one of a kind, the first version made exactly that way. She thought about it. Like me, she said. Mason smiled at his little girl. Yeah, he said, like you. For you and me, that picture changes everything. For 2 nights, Mason sat at his kitchen table, digging through a notepad and the thin paperwork that clueless dealer Logan had blindly handed over, connecting every hidden detail he could extract against his knowledge of classic Aston Martins from the 50s and 60s. He had wrenched on plenty of vintage British cars back at Dawson Brothers, and he totally understood the basic bones of those old cars well enough to spot when something was entirely different. The machine in his garage broke all the rules. Its roof sat flatter than any standard production DB model he had ever seen. Even the door skins curved strangely at the back edges. The rear slope did not match a single photograph in any car catalog he could dig up. The vehicle felt like an Aston Martin, much like a rough sketch resembles a final masterpiece. The brilliant intention was obvious. The shape was there, but this was raw. It was built differently, created long before the final factory plans were ever set in stone. He phoned his buddy Ryan Brooks on Wednesday night. Ryan was his best friend since their early shop days. A sharply focused guy who had moved on to work in car insurance investigation. He knew everything about rare vehicle identification, spotting fake registrations and tracing chassis. Mason plainly described his barn find and asked Ryan if he could maybe run a trace on that specific vehicle identification number. Ryan went dead silent. He promised to call back. 4 hours later, his name lit up the phone. His voice carried a tight, flat tone that Mason instantly recognized from the past. It was the sound of a guy holding uncomfortable secrets. That specific number had been wiped from an insurance database roughly 22 years ago. The removal was just basic paperwork, nothing illegal or shady. The blind system labeled the car as completely destroyed in a crash, closing the record forever. No active registration, 0 liens, and absolutely no living owner on file. To the blind system, this car did not exist. Mason asked if that meant the car was actually stolen. Ryan said it meant the history was messy, and that was a very real difference. You and I know dealers miss the gold. Back at the lot, things were shifting fast for Logan. One of his old shop detailers, a kid named Craig, who worked at that clueless dealership for 2 years before getting fired over missing pay, reached out to Mason through a buddy. He spilled everything he knew about where the car came from. That hidden masterpiece had arrived at. Let's look at the dealer. 14 months ago, he snagged this in a bulk probate buyout. It came from some old collector who passed away without close family left. His entire estate was dumped fast by an administrator who just wanted a quick flat fee. Logan grabbed 6 vehicles there. He listed 5, flipping 4 of them within 3 short months. But that vintage Aston Martin, completely ignored. He took one look at the rust and decided this scrap metal wasn't worth his time. So he just shoved the classic car to the back lot under a cheap tarp. Never bothered checking the vehicle identification number. Never even thought to call a restoration expert. He assumed a dirty, dead old British car was useless, just another piece of worthless trash. That assumption completely blinded him to the life-changing opportunity buried beneath the grime. But guys like Mason have vision. Late one Thursday, he was scrubbing the passenger frame. just stripping away heavy rust, scraping metal with a wire brush, when his light hit a steel marking that stopped him cold. It wasn't a standard part number, not a normal serial code. Just initials and a hyphen stamped right into the chassis rail, quarter-inch letters reading AMP7. He laid dead still on his creeper, just staring at that metal for a full minute. Then he snapped 3 quick photos on his phone and dialed Ryan. When Mason read those markings out loud, Ryan went dead silent for a really long time. Finally, he slowly explained that P-Series factory stamps in Aston Martin files from the 1960s only ever pointed to prototype builds. Secret, experimental cars built totally outside the normal production line. One-off machines made to test wild engineering ideas before ever starting up a mass manufacturing run. He told Mason to step away from the car immediately. He warned that if P7 meant what he actually thought it meant. Now here is where you and I realize the stakes. Mason needed a real expert. He needed them before he dared to turn another single bolt. Charlotte Hayes spent 18 years proving she was the most meticulous detective in the business, the top authentication specialist in the North American classic car scene. Working from a tight townhouse office in Midtown Manhattan, she had personally verified, appraised and brokered sales for over 200 massive, historically significant barn finds. Pre-war Bugattis, Coach-built Rolls-Royces. But her real sweet spot was British sports cars from the 1950s and 60s. That golden era, most historians agree, gave us the most important road machines ever created. Major auction houses and high-end estate lawyers swore by her word. Insurance underwriters and collectors across 3 whole continents. She was also, in her very own words, super suspicious of random callers who claimed they just discovered some automotive holy grail. Because usually, those folks were just dreaming. Their imaginations totally outran the hard evidence. Mason made the call on a Friday morning. He gave his name, his town, and just the raw facts, the chassis stamp, the weird construction, the missing insurance records, that old photograph and its 4-word inscription. He read the stamp out loud, AMP7, and then just shut his mouth. Charlotte told him to repeat that last part, so he told her again. 4 seconds of dead silence. Mason would later find out that was a massive pause for her. You know what happens next. She needed close-up shots of the marking in engine bay, the door panels, the interior trim, and that one crucial photograph. I promised to send them within the hour. I fired them over in 40 minutes. Charlotte called back that evening. Her voice had completely changed its tune. You know that professional skepticism? It hadn't completely vanished yet. It was just focused now, not general doubt. She was questioning specific details now, not just dismissing my crazy claim. She admitted the markings matched secret Aston Martin prototype codes from 1960 to 1965. She pointed out the engine bay construction shown in my photos didn't match any standard production car she knew from that entire era. She had to see my scrap metal in person, said she'd drive down to Pennsylvania that weekend. She rolled up on a Saturday morning, driving a gray sedan carrying this heavy aluminum instrument case and the guarded caution of an expert who had been let down before. She spent 4 hours crawling over my Aston Martin in total silence, scribbling in a little leather notebook, pulling off panels, checking every seam, taking material samples right off the doors. She studied the engine block through a jeweler's loop hanging around her neck. I just stood nearby watching quietly. My daughter Ella read on a corner stool. Even she knew this golden opportunity demanded absolute patience. When Charlotte finally stood up and looked right at me, that heavy caution in her eyes had not completely faded, but right beneath it was something she was trying really hard to hide. The pure excitement of an expert who spent her whole career chasing one mythical car, and just realized she was standing right in front of it. Listen to this. Right there in rural Pennsylvania, she told me what she found. Those dirty body panels were hand-formed aluminum alloy, never pressed steel. The fading interior stitching along the seats. It perfectly matched an experimental Aston Martin layout from one secret 1962 report. The rusty engine block actually had a partial casting mark. It proved this was a prototype the company swore never even left their factory floor. And the specific alloy used in those custom brackets I found under the hood completely matched the exact surface texture and working style. Materials used exclusively inside the famous Newport Pagnell experimental workshop during one very specific 18-month window back then. Charlotte looked at me, said if the history could be proven through solid paperwork that could pass the strict authentication standards of major auction houses, then this pile of junk in my rented garage was almost definitely a one-off prototype built for an American buyer in the early 1960s. A vintage car the factory's own records swore had been completely destroyed. Its survival would easily be one of the greatest automotive discoveries in the last 40 years. She took a breath, told me the value to a restorer would be astronomical. I asked her to define astronomical. She said well over $1 million. I just collapsed onto the floor. You can imagine the news spread fast. I hadn't breathed a word to anyone except Ryan and Charlotte. But in a tiny Rust Belt town the size of Millbrook, a fancy Manhattan expert arriving on a weekend with testing gear sparks questions, which spark conversations, which ignite wild rumors. And within 72 hours, rumors about the scrapyard Aston Martin project eventually reached the wrong ears. It reached Logan Pierce. Logan showed up unannounced on a Tuesday, stepping into the workshop. Mason was wrenching on the intake manifold when a car pulled up. Then he heard that distinct, familiar cadence of Logan barking into his phone right as the garage door rolled up. Logan wore his usual uniform, a crisp, expensive pressed shirt, polished leather shoes, and a watch worth more than Mason's truck. You and I know this type. He strutted in like he owned the place, totally blind to the real work happening here. He glanced at the classic car frame, looked at Mason, and smirked. He claimed a tiny paperwork mistake happened during the salvage title transfer, and that the dealership simply had to reverse the entire sale. He offered to hand Mason a full refund for the scrap price right away. Pure cash, making the whole problem vanish without any fuss or noise. Mason just set the part down, wiped his grease-stained hands, and calmly stated the restoration project was not for sale. Logan's fake smile did not vanish, it hardened. He spoke softly, sounding like a guy doing a huge favor, claiming the paperwork for the broken Aston Martin was actually filed wrong, stating that selling a vintage car with cloudy history broke the law, and if Mason kept this diamond in the rough, the messy title could drag him into court. A legal maze he could not survive. Just hand back the rusty metal, take the cash, and dodge a massive headache. Mason soaked it all in, then calmly replied he would call his lawyer first. Logan's face dropped instantly. Every single trace of that smug grin vanished. He leaned on the doorframe, dropping his voice, warning Mason to think very carefully about the huge gap between a cheap fight and corporate warfare. A legal battle over a valuable classic car title could easily drag on for years, bleeding a working father dry until he had nothing left to give. He spoke flatly, never raising his voice, which made it the most chilling, deliberate threat a guy like Mason could hear. Little Ella sat doing homework just 7 feet away from them. She kept her eyes glued to the paper, but her tiny shoulders tensed up instantly, freezing completely, the exact way innocent kids freeze when they pick up on dark, grown-up tension everyone thinks they miss. Once Logan finally left, Mason called Charlotte. She raced back from New York the next day holding Firepower, the original luxury car sales contract from Logan's dealership, pulled straight from a title search, plus 2 older receipts she tracked down through a messy probate estate liquidation process. She sat right at Mason's kitchen table. Let's look at what they uncovered line by single line. They realized that Logan, utterly blind to the value of the scrap metal he sold, had drafted the legal paperwork with an ironclad thoroughness that completely ruined his own trap. The formal bill of sale identified the vehicle precisely by its chassis number, handing full title and absolute ownership to Mason Carter without a single string attached. And it was signed by Logan himself, completely notarized on the day of sale. 0 error clauses, absolutely no legal right to back out. You see the irony? Logan dumped the supposed junk car clean because he wanted Mason stuck forever. He never dreamed that piece of scrap would change a man's life. That dealer's arrogance built his very own trap. 3 nights after Logan dismissed my car, I bolted awake at 2 in the morning to noise outside. I was instantly awake. You learn to sleep light when your garage holds a life-changing barn find. I sprinted across the dark yard in 30 seconds and found the garage side door hanging open. The padlock wasn't busted, it was picked clean, tossed aside. Inside, the folder holding my restoration documents was ripped open. Papers were scattered everywhere across the concrete floor. They had yanked open every single drawer on my rolling tool chest. But nothing was missing. I scanned the shop fast. My vintage Aston Martin sat there completely untouched. That intruder only wanted the paperwork. Good thing I hid a trail camera outside after Logan came by. It caught everything from 11:43 to 2:17. The video was crystal clear. A guy wearing a dark jacket was creeping right along my shop wall. You could see a logo stitched onto his left chest. It was the logo for Pierce Prestige Motors. I backed that security footage up to 2 separate cloud drives before dawn. Fired off copies to Charlotte and Ryan. Then I sat at my kitchen table with coffee. That's when I cemented the vision I had since the night I uncovered that hidden chassis stamp. I wasn't selling this diamond in the rough blind, untested or undocumented. I was going to turn this scrap into a masterpiece. Not to keep and not to drive around, but to roll into the authentication session Charlotte was setting up with 2 British classic car experts. To show them exactly what I knew it was. A living, breathing machine firing up under its own power. With ironclad history and legal ownership no one could ever question. Charlotte had a direct line to a massive Manhattan classic car auction. She had quietly spoken with their head of provenance research. The auction house was hooked. But first, 2 recognized experts had to physically authenticate the car. We needed a flawless title history and enough paperwork to back up the legendary story. Charlotte guessed 2 or 3 weeks. I told her I needed 14 days. She asked if that was even possible. I said it was my only option. Those next 14 days pushed me harder than anything, even the dark weeks after losing my wife. A different kind of struggle, but it demanded the same intense, absolute focus. You and I know urgency. And how hard work narrows your entire world to a single mission that guarantees a new life. I wrenched from 5 in the morning straight until midnight every day, stopping only when my hands began shaking. I practically moved into that garage, eating at the bench and sleeping on a cot. After the second night, my daughter did her homework in the corner every night. She adapted to this new rhythm with that beautiful, uncomplaining flexibility that makes her so incredibly special. She passed me tools without even being asked. She held the work light steady for hours, never complaining once. She brought sandwiches on schedule, leaving them quietly without breaking my intense concentration. And honestly, I realized then, her quiet support was as vital to building our future as any wrench I turned. Stick with me here. I uncovered this so-called scrap metal layer by layer. Scraping away the grime revealed hidden details that completely changed what this was. The original leather. It hid right under cheap vinyl some fool had slapped over the seats. A rare tanner's mark appeared, which our appraiser Charlotte identified. She verified it came from an exclusive Aston Martin parts supplier, tied straight to their 1960s workshop. The dealer called it trash, but removing that ugly dash proved him wrong. Hand-brushed aluminum stared back at me with a custom dishboard that completely defied any standard production specs. Then, reaching deep behind that custom dash architecture, my fingers actually felt a folded piece of paper. I froze entirely. I called Ella over. My daughter rushed over, and together we carefully unfolded it under the bright work light. Just 1 page of heavy cream paper filled with tiny, neat handwriting in dark blue ink that had faded to a rich brown. It was a letter. The author only signed off with 3 simple initials below. RHW, and it wasn't addressed to any specific person either. In the exact words of a proud craftsman, he detailed building this very car. A secret prototype model, shipped straight to a private buyer in the United States. He just called the buyer the American, noting the classic car was delivered in autumn 1963. He explained that this vintage machine was built way past any normal specs the factory offered to the public. It carried radical engineering choices the company was too scared to put into mass production. And whatever happened to it after delivery was a total mystery. The final line sat all by itself at the very bottom edge. It read, "I have no doubt it will outlast all of us." I read it twice, absolutely stunned. This car wasn't just some forgotten trash. It was buried by bad luck, hidden behind a fake accident to close an insurance file. buried under decades of dust just because narrow-minded people only saw scrap metal. But it survived. That old mechanic RHW was dead right. 2 weeks later, I finally finished rewiring the whole ignition. I secured the fuel system I had painstakingly rebuilt, checked the oil and coolant, then snapped the final spark plug wire firmly into its place. I stared at the engine. I looked back at Ella, standing right there with her arms crossed, praying this pile of parts would actually change our lives today. I turned the key. The straight six coughed twice, paused for a split second where the whole garage seemed to hold its breath, and then roared to life. It sounded like a heavy chord struck on a massive instrument built for a giant hall. Deep, steady, and finally breathing again. My little girl gasped, covering her mouth. I gripped the steering wheel hard, pressed my forehead against it, and just stayed. Right there for a moment before I trusted myself to look. You know that feeling when life shifts? Charlotte planned our auction so incredibly fast. It was an invite-only classic car sale held in a sleek private gallery down in Manhattan, packed with elite car collectors and deep-pocketed estate buyers. The institutional buyers were already briefed on this hidden gem's potential. 6 days before the sale, 2 English specialists confirmed what Mason saw all along. A former curator from the Aston Martin Heritage Trust, plus an independent historian who really understood value, had spent decades tracking down rare British prototypes and forgotten builds. Both experts spent 2 full days studying the machine, and both reports confirmed the exact same reality. This forgotten treasure was authentic. It perfectly matched an AMP series prototype designation straight out of the 1960 to 1964 window, a true one-of-a-kind classic unmatched in any collection. The auction house's legal team thoroughly reviewed every single title document, Charlotte's paper trail, plus Mason's original brilliant sales contract. Their final verdict was incredibly clear. Mason held a perfectly clean, completely undisputed title to an incredibly valuable historic automotive masterpiece. That Wednesday, the prized car rode into Manhattan inside a secure, climate-controlled transport trailer. Mason and Ella drove down separately, reaching the city the night before the big auction. Charlotte booked them a nice little hotel just 3 blocks from the vintage car gallery. Little Ella had never even seen New York. She spent 20 minutes glued to the window, watching the busy city streets down below, staring out with pure awe, taking in a world far bigger than she could ever imagine. Mason watched his daughter, quietly thinking of his late wife during this massive, life-changing moment. He then gently tucked that memory away, keeping his clear eyes on the future. He called down for room service, since it was past 9 and Ella was totally starving. Meanwhile, Logan Pierce finally caught wind of it. No one told him directly, but in the specific world of high-end classic car sales, you and I know a hidden gem this huge never stays secret for very long. And Logan still had a few sleazy connections among the brokers in that wealthy network. He showed up at the auction gallery the morning of the big sale. He sneaked past the door check by flashing some former client's business card like a petty scammer. Charlotte spotted the desperate fool in the second row before bidding started. She later told Mason it hit her with total clarity. She saw right through him, knowing exactly what his desperate play would be, and standing completely ready to crush it. Then Logan finally made his move. During the final check, 40 minutes before the very first classic car was called, he stormed up to 2 auction staffers, practically shouting so the big money collectors nearby would hear his bold claims. Shouting that the car's ownership was disputed, claiming the original sales paperwork was secured under very shady circumstances, and that he'd file a massive lawsuit if they went ahead with the auction. Several heads quickly turned. The room's vibe totally shifted, not quite panic, but the sharp focus of serious investors who, like us, showed up for greatness and refused to let some amateur ruin their shot. Charlotte was already springing into action before Logan even finished. She handed the head of legal a thick folder she built just for this pathetic stunt. Inside, the original bill of sale featuring Logan's own notarized signature, the complete, bulletproof ownership trail, plus time-stamped trail camera footage catching his desperate little break-in at the garage. Today, let's look at the file. It showed Logan's visit, plus sworn statements detailing his ugly threats, plus a sharp letter from Mason's lawyer, stating that messing with the legal auction of this barn find would be treated as tortious interference, triggering an immediate and heavy legal strike. The legal head scanned the entire folder in 11 minutes, whispering with two colleagues. He marched across the room to Logan, delivering the verdict with the cold politeness from someone paid to shut down messy situations fast. The paperwork clearly proved Mason was the true legal owner. The classic car auction was moving forward today. Logan could try his luck in court later through proper channels, but right now he needed to step completely aside. The lawyer warned that Logan was only staying by their grace. One more outburst, and they would strip his auction pass completely. Logan finally sat down. He sank into the second row, totally silent for 3 long hours. Whatever he expected to happen, some fearful hesitation or surrender. Mason, completely crumbling under the pressure of his threat, simply did not happen. The paperwork held up. Mason's careful groundwork survived it. Down in front, Mason sat flanked by Ella and Charlotte. He never gave the guy who completely missed the vision a single glance. Bidding sparked at $600,000, climbing so fiercely it paralyzed the entire room. 1, 2, 3.5 million. 5, 6.8, 8 million. 2 investors remained. One in the room, the other fighting over the phone. They traded numbers back and forth in $200,000 jumps with, "We are watching the cold focus of men who actually see the masterpiece." At 9.8 million, the caller made one last bet. The auctioneer lifted his gavel, locked eyes with the floor bidder, waited. It slammed down at $10 million. That sharp crack echoed everywhere. Heavy applause broke out, rolling on and on for a very long time. Mason gripped his daughter's hand. No tears fell yet. That relief hit later. Quietly, away from the crowd, exactly how the biggest life shifts always happen. Right then he just held her hand, staring at the Aston Martin on stage, flawless, silver, and perfectly restored. A vintage machine buried for decades under blind negligence, finally respected for the absolute masterpiece it was always meant to be. Back in the second row, Logan Pierce stared blankly at that same vehicle. Whatever bitter regret he swallowed right then was strictly his own problem. The masterpiece he threw away was about to become public knowledge. The morning after the big sale, Logan cornered Mason near the hotel checkout counter, practically begging for a quick private word together. Mason humored the guy. They grabbed 2 seats by the large front window. Logan rambled on, desperately trying to justify how that first scrapyard deal went down. Pleading he honestly couldn't see the true gold mine sitting right there. Complaining about his own business costs and how brutal the dealership market was lately. He never apologized, but you and I know that kind of naked desperation, and Mason instantly recognized it too. It is the tragic look of a guy finally waking up to the scale of the wealth he abandoned, frantically rattling a heavy door that is already bolted entirely shut. Logan hinted that since he technically handed over the keys to that neglected frame initially, he deserved a little reward, a tiny slice of the profits pitched so very, very carefully. He actually called it fairness. Mason quietly listened until Logan finished talking. Then, cool as ice, Mason revealed the truth. You and I know guys like Logan. He sold that car for $3,800, assuming a working-class guy couldn't spot a hidden masterpiece. Mason stated Logan had viciously threatened him, sent goons to break into his workshop, and actively tried ruining a totally legal sale right in front of witnesses. Mason made it crystal clear he owed the greedy dealer absolutely nothing. He only said it once. Then he stood, shook the man's hand with that steady respect he always carried, and simply walked away to change his life. Charlotte moved incredibly fast after the auction. That hidden trail camera footage, paired with Mason's rock-solid written record of Logan's nasty threats, got handed straight to the district attorney by the auction house security, acting exactly as their legal team had strongly advised. Within 2 weeks, investigators were crawling all over Pierce Prestige Motors, not just for breaking in, but for a massive trail of shady deals they found once they started digging. Forged title papers discovered on multiple vintage cars. Customers forced to sign confusing contracts they were never actually given time to read. And at least one shady purchase from a probate, where the grieving estate manager admitted to investigators he had no idea what he signed. Old complaints from Logan's past customers had been piling up for many years. Ignored on their own, These separate complaints finally began to build into a solid, heavily documented, and legally actionable case. His dealer license got instantly suspended. That flashy, superficial showroom shut down completely. That shiny glass building on Route 9 took on the heavy, dead silence of a place that completely lost its purpose. Logan hired lawyers, bracing for what they warned would be a long, brutal legal battle. His downfall wasn't quick or flashy. It was just the slow, grinding result of greed catching up to him. As you and I know, that's exactly how arrogant people fall. The week those auction funds hit, Mason paid off his remaining medical bills. $47,000 that followed him like a dark shadow for 3 years. Then he proudly paid 3 months advanced rent on a much larger garage space just 2 blocks from Ella's school. And started a real business, registering it with the county under the proud name Ella's Classic Garage. He bought a hand-painted sign from a local shop, clean white background, totally simple and unflashy. You and I know that kind of honest sign. It proves a visionary works inside. He bought a solid 10-year-old sedan with a flawless maintenance record. A practical, reliable ride that fired right up on freezing mornings and took tools he already owned. The very morning he bought it, he proudly drove his daughter to school. She called it a good car, asking if they could play some music. Mason smiled and said yes. 3 months after that legendary auction, Charlotte set up a trip for them to visit the restored car near Philadelphia. The new buyer had built a private museum celebrating incredible British auto history there. The owner, Walter, was a quiet guy in his 60s who spent 30 years hunting this rare series. He welcomed them with a simple respect Mason deeply appreciated. To Walter, buying that Aston Martin wasn't about money, it was about completing his vision. He spent 30 years believing this exact piece of scrap metal, the P7, was the only unit shipped for private delivery. They saw a total loss in those closed insurance files. He guided them through the museum. Visionaries don't look at these machines as mere trophies. They are subjects, hidden potential waiting to be truly uncovered. The Aston Martin sat in its own bay, bathed in warm light. That steady glow stripped away shadows, revealing the raw aluminum opportunity waiting underneath. Every hand-shaped toolmark told a story of original, undeniable craftsmanship. Every curve formed by pure skill, untouched by a mindless factory press. You and I can see it wasn't a relic, it was a record of human potential. The physical proof of what dedicated people were truly capable of, achieving at a precise moment when they were finally handed the freedom to create without limits. They built a masterpiece meant to survive, waiting for someone with the vision to bring it back. Ella stood there, studying the reborn machine for a long time. Then she looked right at her father, asking him directly, just like she always did, was he sad this masterpiece wasn't theirs anymore? Mason weighed her words carefully. He never brushed off his daughter's curiosity. He explained that the car was never truly theirs to lock away and hoard forever. It was an opportunity they uncovered, theirs to understand and theirs to breathe life into. What that hidden treasure had given them could never be erased. The massive payout was real, the restored garage was real, the erased debt was real, but those weren't even the most life-changing rewards. The biggest reward was simpler. He had walked into a dealership that completely wrote him off. He took the scrap metal they blindly threw away, and through the unyielding work of his own hands and his visionary patience, he proved their arrogant, blind judgment was absolutely dead wrong. Not just wrong about the scrap car, wrong about him. Ella let that reality sink in. Then she said she believed the car always knew its true worth, simply waiting for someone who could actually see past the surface rust. Mason watched his daughter standing there, bathed in warm light by that reborn machine. He stayed quiet for a moment, then he said she was probably right. Let's fast forward. Charlotte showed up at the restored garage one chilly November Thursday. She wore a much heavier coat than their last meeting. She brought a massive, life-changing opportunity. 3 clients had classic cars needing true vision, not quick flips. They needed genuine mechanical work from a visionary who understood the masterpieces, rather than just another financial instrument. She recognized Mason's rare gift. His rare mix of skill and pure vision was worth turning into a business. She laid out the deal. She would bring the clients. Mason would provide the work, and they would split the profits. Mason saw the potential, but he had one firm rule. Charlotte patiently waited. He told her that whatever this new arrangement demanded, absolutely nothing starts before 8:45 on school days. Driving his daughter every single morning was the real priority, and completely non-negotiable. For the first time, Charlotte smiled. A completely genuine smile. She told him that arrangement worked perfectly for her. The next morning, he drove Ella to school exactly like he always did. In that trusty 10-year-old sedan, cruising right along their usual everyday route. Pulling into that parent drop-off line, you realize how one rusty opportunity changed absolutely everything. Ella balanced her backpack, quietly reviewing notes for the day. Scanning that spiral notebook, perfectly innocent, she still had absolutely no idea. She didn't know the wreckage I'd shielded her from, or the scrapyard dog I had to become to build this life. Someday, when she finally grows up and looks back, you and I know time polishes everything. Our rough history will eventually shine like a beautifully restored, priceless classic car. She snapped her notebook shut as we rolled up to the curb. Without glancing my way, she casually muttered she'd see me at 3. I swore I'd be there. I watched my greatest investment walk into school. I hit the gas, heading back to my garage where 3 worthless scrap piles sat waiting for my vision. Up above the door, a hand-painted sign on a clean whiteboard told me exactly what I needed to see.